This is Joseph Carpenter. Today is November 7th, 2024, and I'm interviewing Dr. Charles Travis. This interview is taking place on the campus of the University of Texas at Arlington. It is sponsored by the University of Texas at Arlington History and Geography Department and is part of the UTA Author Insights collection. Dr. Travis is an associate professor of geography and GIS at the University of Texas at Arlington. He's a fellow for the Center of Greater Southwestern Studies at the University of Texas at Arlington and an associate researcher for environmental humanities at the School of Histories and Humanities, Trinity College, the University of Dublin. His most recent work, Environment as a Weapon, Geographies, Histories, and Literature, was published by Springer Press in 2024. Thank you for agreeing to be interviewed today.
You're quite welcome.
Where are you from originally, and tell me a little bit about your growing up.
Well, I was born in New Hampshire, but I never really lived there. We moved around a lot because of my father's desire to become a physician. So I learned to read and write in Italian because my father went to medical school in Bologna, Italy. And we moved back to the States and lived in Massachusetts, upstate New York, and then Rochester, New York, before finally settling around the age of 14 in Toledo, Ohio. I stayed in Toledo, Ohio until I was around 30. And then I pursued my PhD at Trinity College, Dublin in geography after completing a master's at the University of Toledo, Ohio. And then since then I've gone sort of back and forth between Dublin, Ireland, and Florida, New Jersey, and now Texas.
How did you end up in Ireland at the University of Dublin?
When I was 30 years old, my mother had me come over with her and my brother to help move my grandmother back to Dublin. My grandmother had been living with my uncle. My uncle had migrated back to Ireland back in the 1970s. And then he brought my grandmother over, and then they had traveled to the States. So my aunt could get a nursing degree, and they were moving back to Dublin. So I went over in June 1994, right before the Northern Irish peace process. And we ended up in Northwest Ireland, a place called Donegal, in the Gaeltacht area, Gaelic-speaking region, and it was just sort of fascinating for me. And I ended up staying, and then I ended up pursuing a master's in geography, basically as a structure to be able to go to Ireland and do it in a constructive way. And then after I finished my master's, it was suggested to me that I could pursue a PhD in historical, cultural, literary geography at Trinity College, Dublin. I contacted Dr. Mark Hennessy, who became my supervisor, PhD supervisor, and I went over and did my PhD in literary geography of 1930s Ireland. And basically what I did is I looked at how writers of the period examined ideas like identity, landscape, and sense of place in their works, in contrast to the way that the state was officially representing itself in its history and its geography. So,
how did you become interested in geography?
Well, at the time I was pursuing pre-med, and I had worked in a hospital for 10 years, and my father was a physician. I knew that was going to be like. And I didn't really have an interest, and I got recruited by Professor David Nemeth at the University of Toledo, and said, we'll pay you to study Ireland. I said, that's great. Sign me up. Right. My father wasn't initially pleased, but when I graduated with my PhD from Trinity, he came around.
Felt a little bit better about it?
Yes.
So what inspired you to write this book, and how does it connect to your broader academic interests and research?
Well, I've been working on another book that I'm still working on, thinking that I needed to complete something for my tenure. But as a geography and history department, they used other criteria besides a monograph. And I've had plenty of publications. So the previous book was meant to be a book on spatial humanities on the West, and I'm still working on that. But the editors, it was the first book in a series, a proposed series, and they were sort of nitpicky about it, which is fine. But at that time, when I was going to go publish it, they wanted me to do things to it, and I just hadn't, I was finished with that subject for a while. It needed to be put on the back burner. But I still had all this energy to write. You have that when you write a book, you know. And I contributed a chapter to a colleague of mine's Springer edited volume on geohazards. Mm. And the chapter was on environment as a weapon. Mm. And I really enjoyed writing it because I'm sort of a dilettante in military history and literature and everything. But it was just something that was fun to do, and I had an interest in it. And I thought to myself, each of these sections could be a chapter of a book if I expanded it. And it would allow me to go and do all this sort of research on something that I just really curious and interested in. And so I have a good relationship with Springer Press, so I pitched them the idea of the book, and they liked it, and they gave me a contract. Another thing that sort of drove it was I had a great uncle, Matthew McInerney, who was a combat engineer in the Marines at Iwo Jima. Mm-hmm. And he was blown off a bridge and he had his spleen taken out. When I was 12, I had my spleen taken out. Oh. So I had to sort of bond with him. Mm-hmm. And then my paternal grandfather, Charles Bartlett Travis, who I'm the fourth and the last. So my wife we picked Senan for my son's name. He was a production engineer manager at Alcoa in Messina, New York, where they built all the airframes for the combat planes in World War II. And he would tell me stories about the films that they would show them. He said it was, nothing that was in the media at the time. So that sort of interested me. I did my field work my MA field work in Ireland at the time of the peace process along the border. So I just have had this interest in the relationship between geography, literature, and history, and how environment had been part and parcel of warfare. And it also is in the context of global warming. James Lovelock idea of the Earth as a system that acts like an organism. It isn't one, but the different planetary systems, the atmosphere, the geology, the hydrosphere, the cryosphere, all these are interactive, and that given the way that global warming has really rapidly occurred since the Industrial Revolution, and it's an issue that we're dealing with, how the Earth might be weaponizing itself against us as a species. I see. Because if we're all part of this, we're part of the biosphere, if it is a system that readjusts, it might be readjusting, the human species is causing us problems, So, and that seems a bit far-fetched, but it was interesting to me. James Lovelock wrote a book called The Revenge of Gaia, which sort of has that trope. So this idea of environment, not as some stage that we play our roles on, but it's parcel of us. It's sort of like the old adage about geography being the setting for history, and I don't really agree with that. I think geography has agency, as does the environment. Sure. And I was aware of Clausewitz's take on terrain, and there's a couple of really good books out there on this, but they were sort of talking about it from more of a nuts and bolts approach, rather than I was interested in the perceptual things, how people perceive the environment during a period, and how yet it has this continuity throughout history and geographies of being weaponized, and also how that was reflected in period literature, which really adds color and context to something like Napoleon's invasion of Russia. Tolstoy's War and Peace, which Tolstoy himself was no sort of armchair general. He had been he'd fought in the Crimean War. He actually went to the battlefield Borodino and, measured it out. A lot of writers have done the use of geography. James Joyce, when he wrote Ulysses, Ulysses seems almost unintelligible, but he used a map of Dublin, a Tom's map of Dublin, to trace out all the characters and their journeys. So, and you find a lot of writers using cartography, geography as a means to plot their works. For instance, Shelby Foote's novel Shiloh. It opens with a map of the battle, and each of the characters has a location on that map. And so he's telling that story from many different perspectives. And it's fictionalized, but it's also historically accurate. So you feel like you're in this panoramic environment when you read the novel. Sort of like the panorama that was created of the Battle of Borodino that's in Russia. You go in and you feel like you're actually inside the environment. And that was the thing that I was interested in. How the environment in warfare, they're immersive, how that was perceived in literature. And geography is a great subject because everything's tied to place somehow, but you can bring different things in. You can bring biochemistry in with literature if you want, planning and with art, whatever you want to do, and that's why I pursued geography. But I also have a very strong interest in history, and one of the things I did in high school, which was sort of a mistake, is I took the college level placement exams in history, and so I didn't have to take any history courses in college, which I sort of regret because I was at the University of Toledo. Peter Linebaugh was there. There's some good historians, and I probably would have enjoyed it, but at the time when you're 19, 20, you're not thinking on that sort of level. Plus, I'd been reading history anyway. I mean, I was doing my own self-tutoring, so. But when I circled back for my PhD, especially the history component really came out. And I think that I landed on my feet when I was appointed here in the Department of History. I mean, I'd been in other geography departments where they really focus on the earth sciences and physical geography, and that's fine. I teach physical geography here. But talking about history in those types of departments was sort of, there wasn't any sort of collaboration in that sense. Whereas here, you hear what your colleagues in history do, and it really sort of enhances the historical geographical perspective that I've been able to develop. So, so I felt, this is a great department within the right, this type of book. And interesting enough, I've been to geography conferences where it's been sold along with a lot of other books, and there seems to be an interest in it.
But it creates it creates a broader interest than just history or geography or literature, because it's really all three of those.
Yes. And if you go back to the Western roots of geography, you've got a couple of traditions. You have Eratosthenes, who calculated the Earth was a sphere, sort of scientific, but then you also have the storytelling, historic poetic tradition, where, Herodotus, and who's considered a geographer as well as a fellow of history, and Strabo collected stories from travelers to assemble sort of a mosaic. So it was a form of storytelling as well, the art and the science. And geography is a broad church. It's also its weakness because it can become too broad. But it is at the marriage of art and science. And I like that the idea of a liberal arts education where you're literate and numerative, and you combine the two as means and methods to explore the world and teach and work on problem solving, which I think is very important, because without that you become a technician, or you become sort of solipsistic, like you just live in your own sort of academic world. Whereas within the liberal arts, geography within the liberal arts, is actually, it's a fun thing to do, but it's also a problem-solving way of solving, looking at the world,
But
and
it really does complete the story as well in
yes.
history and in literature. Geography, understanding geography really fills out the story.
Well, there was a reason Kant, when he designed his modern university system, put time and place as cornerstones, basically history and geography as cornerstones.
Right.
Because you study everything in time or place, whether you're doing chemistry or physics or business studies or mathematics, it's happening in some time and place. And that seemed to me, my father was a big proponent of liberal arts education, and foundation is sort of Kantian structure of our universities. And it's very important to have that foundation. And so, like I said, I landed on my feet when I was appointed here, and I was able to pursue these things that I did, but I had to do my other work when I was at Trinity.
Right.
I was working as a sort of a contract researcher, basically. So they got the money, and this is a job, and I did it. But on my own time, I did my own stuff.
Right.
And so coming here was sort of a liberation in that sense that I can.
see.
Now I'm back working with them, but I'm more on my own terms than I do,
Right.
So, and this was just something fun. It was something I wanted to do after earning tenure. A sort of a snorkel clearing exercise and a way to take that energy. The other book is floating around there. I'm getting approached by people and publishers, and I'm not sure right now what I'm going to do with it, but it's a piece of work I'd like to get out there, so I'm probably going to have to get working on another book. But it's always good to have a pot boiling in the background.
Right.
You know what I mean? Even though you're pursuing other things.
Well, describe the research process for this book, and what were you surprised by? What did you encounter that surprised you in your research?
I was surprised at how people you would consider just like historians or military people were actually much more multidimensional. Like you look at James Dickey, the poet laureate. He was a bomber in World War II. A lot of the people of that generation, because they were drafted, they had to. People like William Manchester. And I always admired writers like that. And I think I was trying to find examples of writers like that from the past, and how the experience of war and environment imprinted itself into literature. And you can see it, the Epic of Gilgamesh, story of the flood, and then there's, Beowulf, which is it's all about environment and war. The cattle raid of Cooley, the Irish myth, and there's a great image in that poem of at the end of the legend. The two bulls face off against each other in the cattle raid. The bull from Cooley, which is a story which the force is trying to kidnap, kills the white bull, but he's mortally injured, and he staggers home eastward across the Irish landscape. In doing so, he's stumbling and scraping against things, and it became a myth on how the drumlin landscape was shaped.
I see.
So you're talking about, from one sense, you're looking at ideas of glaciation from a very just physical geography standpoint. From the other end, you've got this myth of this bull that actually carved the landscape. But it's a landscape that unifies both the positivistic view and the sort of poetic view. And I was very interested in that sort of thing. And I found that in researching. So to a military historian, the examples in the book are sort of basic 101, combat, Napoleon's invasion, the Civil War, the Vietnam War. Those are well-trod case studies. But I was trying to approach them from the point of view of how would a writer look at this? How was environment, really a part of these things, these battles? How did they play a role in it, both as a setting but also as a weapon? How they were weaponized? how commanders thought about that, how the day-to-day grunts thought about it,
Right.
particularly in Vietnam. The idea that you went from, the American cities or countryside into this tropical region where the ground seemed to be almost part of what you were fighting. It
Yes.
became part of the war.
Right. It was an enemy.
And how it was utilized effectively
Yes.
by the North Vietnamese, the tunnel system that they're dealing with in Gaza. I mean,
Yes.
that was perfected under, the North Vietnamese, and how they could appear in this. There's an analogy there with when the British came over to try to suppress what they felt was an English rebellion, which is what the Revolutionary War started out. It was an
Right.
English Civil War, basically.
Yes.
And they came over and they were fighting this enemy that had adopted fighting techniques from the Mohawks, indigenous, the Haudenosaunee,
Yes.
and use that environment. And it's the same thing happened to the United States when it went into Vietnam, where the Vietnamese are adapted. It was in their environment, and they used that because, you had this huge industrial military complex, and yet
Right.
it was stymied by the environment. And of course, Agent Orange, it didn't work, and
Right.
the high-level bombing didn't work.
Right.
And eventually, you cut your losses, and And I know there's an argument that the Vietnam War was actually successful up until a point.
Mm-hmm.
The war had been won, but then it was lost.
Mm-hmm.
But if that's the case, it was lost because of the environment.
Yes.
Because they couldn't control the environment. No matter how many times they tried to grid it, they just couldn't control that. And the North Vietnamese knew this. And they used that effectively.
Mm-hmm.
And, where were they going to go? It was their home. They weren't going to go anywhere.
Well, they've been fighting wars in their own terrain
Since the
for
Chinese,
centuries.
Yes, since the Chinese. And
Yeah.
that country has been invaded,
Mm-hmm.
Chinese, the French,
The Japanese.
the Japanese. And it was the same story.
Mm-hmm.
And it probably would be same, God forbid, America, it would be invaded.
Mm-hmm.
Anytime you invade a country, you're dealing with a terrain that's not yours.
Right.
And an effective resistance is using that terrain, I mean, I remember the 1980s films. What was it, Red Dawn?
Mm-hmm. Red Dawn.
Where the kids go up into the mountain and they're fighting the guerrilla warfare against North Korean troops and Russian troops.
Yes.
I mean, that's an example of it. Now, it's fictional, but it's based upon real historical and
Right. And you
geographical
think about
experiences.
Washington and Valley Forge. You think about Patton, Bastogne. Environment was central. It
Yeah.
did have agency.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of Washington, at the period, battles weren't fought in the winter.
Right.
And that, Washington was on the run.
Yes.
Washington, it was a successful siege of Boston, but that didn't. And then when they moved to New York, the harbor was perfect for the British. They could control the waterway, Hudson. So they controlled the territory. And the Battle of Long Island was a major rout against Washington.
Mm-hmm.
The British used the landscape effectively. They came across the ridge and, did a pincer movement. Washington sort of trapped himself. It was back against the river. Yet they used fog and stealth to retreat back to New York. And then they realized they were in a pickle being on Long Island, which is basically a peninsula.
Mm-hmm.
And they had to get out, and they got out. But they lost their two major forts on either side of the Hudson, and they were in retreat across New Jersey. And then winter happened, and conventional rules were, you retreated. Well, he couldn't afford to retreat, and so they used, the cover of winter. One of the things that came out to me was if there hadn't been iron deposits in that part of Pennsylvania, New Jersey,
Mm-hmm.
you wouldn't have had an industry pop up, the creation of these Durham boats,
Right.
which were heavy, to carry heavy iron, which could also carry troops. And so it was very interesting to me because of the iron deposits
Yeah.
there. There were the presence of these Durham boats that were created to carry heavy iron ore and products down the Delaware River to Philadelphia for trade. And Washington utilized those boats to get his men across the river and then down to a surprise attack. And particularly when you get to Trenton, you have a bluff where Henry Knox set up his cannon on a grid, and they like flush the Hessians out like game birds. And,
Right.
And then the same thing when reinforcements came in. They used the freeze to tramp up to Princeton when, and they used a sort of a ruse that he left behind, a rear guard to make a lot of noise and like they were entrenching. And then the roads froze because, Washington was a planter. He was a farmer, and he could read the weather, and he used that. And so that sort of stuff fascinates me.
Yeah.
That, despite whatever you're against, if you learn how to use the environment as an ally, weather, the terrain, not just for, I remember I did an interview with the Air Force for a job in Alabama, Birmingham at the Air Force Base there, because they were looking for geographers at the time. This was during the Afghanistan, our occupation in Afghanistan. They wanted people to be human geographers to go to do. And the questions that were posed to me is like, well, can you tell me the best place to put a fire base? And I was thinking, you're not thinking about environment. Yes, that's important. The location where you're going to put a fire base is important. But I mean, are you thinking about how the Taliban are using that environment as a weapon against you? And I thought about that. Now, I didn't say that because, in a job interview, maybe I should have.
Right.
But also part of me was like, if I really do get this job, I'm going to be over there. And that's something I really want to do?
Yeah.
Or is it my wife, or fiance at the time, is ever going to allow me to? Which the answer would be, no. What are you doing?
Right.
So, but it was this idea of how environment, when you're up against a mightier force, can become an ally, and how it has been, and how it was weaponized, and then how it was treated with the lessons were there, and they were laid down in pieces of literature, like I said, the Epic of Gilgamesh, Beowulf, the Tane, and then more recently in books, like James Dickey's To the Sea, and in pieces of literature like that, how they contain information. I remember after 9/11 happened, Robert Altman, the film director, convened a panel of his fellow directors, and he said, listen, we taught him how to do this with our films, bring down these buildings, the effect that it would have. And I remember thinking that. I was in a pub in Dublin watching this second building come down live. I said, this is like a movie. The woman next to me said, no, unfortunately it's not. I said, well, I know that, but I mean, this is, and so this idea of art has this dimension to warfare or things that can occur. And that, I think, is a kernel of what drove this book, that interest.
So who did you have in mind as a target audience for this book, and how did that influence your approach?
Well, me, initially, it's a book that I would have liked to have read.
Right.
But this is a question that what publishers ask you. And so to me, it was geographers, historical geographers, military historians, people that are engaging now in what we call the environmental humanities. That sort of audience. And people that still look at geography as both an art and a science, not, one or the other. I mean, I stand very, very modestly and humbly on the shoulders of giants, starting with Strabo and the Eratosthenes, and then the storytellers, and the idea that geography can be part of this geography isn't just maps and locations, places. The geography, the geographical perception that's embedded not only within the discipline, but within literature. Writers have a very keen eye on describing landscape identity and sense of place. Probably so much better than trained geographers. We get that trained out of them because of the rationality. So that idea of the writer as a geographer, and a writer providing insight into this issue of environment as a weapon. So I felt that was very important.
What do you hope the impact of this book will have in the academic community, and more broadly, what societal conversations do you hope it'll provoke?
Well, that answer the second question first, within the context of global warming and climate change. It's something that we have to think about. You know, it's something that you can deny it, but it's still going to happen. It reminds me of the story of Noah, you know.
Right.
I mean, it's the same sort of thing. We do it at our peril. The problem is that it's the most vulnerable people that are really getting on the sharp end of it right now, you know. And the elites or people that can have some impact are making money off of it. And that to me is immoral. So to me, it's an approach, particularly in the United States, which is interesting. People tend to listen to military figures when they talk about global warming. They tend to say, they don't put it off as some sort of coastal elite hoax that, you know, and I've been at conferences with people from the military, particularly in Norfolk, because the sea is reclaiming ground that Norfolk was built on, and they see this as a problem. And they also see what climate change is doing as far as migration and everything causing political instability. And it's been declared a national security issue. So what I'm hoping to do is say, listen, there's a long tradition of environment and warfare in literature. And it culminates to this point where, you know, Lovelock was seen as sort of initially when he came out with his Gaia theory, which he got the name from the author William Golding, the British was his neighbor, the man who wrote Lord of the Flies.
Yes.
And Lovelock was working as a chemist for BP, British Petroleum, trying to come up with a way to create I think it was an amoeba to clean up oil spills or things like that. And so he came up with this Earth systems, it's called Earth System Sciences now, where the Earth acts like an organism. It isn't one, but it acts like one. And he was trying to come up with a name for it, and he was talking with William Golding, and they were going to work together one day. And William Golding said, well, why don't you name it Gaia after the Earth goddess?
Right.
And that was the idea of the great writer, William Golding, and the great chemist, physicist, meeting the mind and how that perfectly encapsulated what I was trying to do. And I think it's that type of thinking that we need to address that. And the type of thinking that and perceptions that I'm describing in the book is sort of the holistic way we're going to have to deal with it. I mean, I have colleagues and friends on the right and on the left, and the proposals, you know, crazy like geoengineering, or the fact that we have to radically alter our economic structure. I mean, they're just not viable. I mean, we've become a consumer global society. That's what we have to address, and we have to address it with ways that, you know, it's not that big a leap to even consider like nuclear energy as an option, which needs to be considered. You know, I've been in job interviews where I've said that, I've never gotten a job, but it's something holistically. And Lovelock was sort of seen as a crackpot initially, but his theories have turned out to be, he's pressing. He's sort of a prophet for our ages, and that's what I was hoping sort of encapsulate in the book. Listen, and I've tried to, you know, I tried to do some promotion of this book, and I've said that you know, the end of this book is that the Earth is weaponizing itself against us, and that's something we need to consider. And you don't get called back for interviews, but I mean, it's a model. But
it's a very literary perspective. You know, it comes across as being mythological or whatever. But when you understand it not so literally, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, this is growing field of geomythology, which I'm interested in, which runs as a sort of a current through some of the chapters. This different way of thinking about the problem, because I've worked on an Andrew Mellon project when I was at Trinity on the new human condition. And all these reports that scientists have made are clear, but it doesn't do anything about the heart of it, which is human behavior. People don't, you know. And so how do you get people on board to start thinking about this, where they'll act in the benefit of our species? And you do that through stories, through myth, through history. And I think that there's a component in this that shows how stories about warfare, myths, and things like that, it's a human activity. Warfare has been around since, Cain and Abel. I mean, that's a biblical reading of it. But since, you know, fighting over resources, fighting, it's still with us. I mean, the things that are going on in Ukraine, the things that are going on in Gaza, I mean, it's all about land. It's all about environment. And it's sort of, I wasn't trying to be prescient in this book. It was just something I was interested in, and these things started happening. Actually, I was writing it when Russia invaded Ukraine. And that's, you know, I mean, it wasn't spurred by it. It just happened to, and I'm seeing it as a relevant thing. And like I said, I'm not a military historian. I feel a bit like a dilettante talking about this, but I do have a deep interest in that. And how, you know, my great uncle is, he ended up being an architect, but also from a very literate family. His sister and my grandmother, we never got any toys for presents. We just got books. We were given books.
Interesting. Yeah.
And that sort of cultivated the idea. And I think it harkens back to that, that idea. And I'm fascinated by the Civil War as well, the American Civil War, because it was the first what I call in the book, the first Anthropocene War. Although Anthropocene hasn't been chosen by the geological commissions as it's a new age, they said it's not. And that's fine, but it's a heuristic model, the idea of how the earth started, human beings started acting as geological forces in themselves, doing things that geological forces had done previously.
Right.
And how humans facilitated that and became, you know, because back in ancient, even before history, you know, volcanoes would explode and would change the atmosphere, the climate on the earth. And that'd be, you know, that's something that's a geological function. But with us digging up coal and fossil fuels and burning it, that activity is doing the things the volcanoes used to do, changing the climate. And that's what I mean. And so the idea of the, you know, sort of stereotypical industrial north versus agrarian south, even though it's more complex than that. Yeah. But the role that geography played in that, all the coal fields, the rivers, the Anaconda blockade, which effectively, you know, halted the southern ability to raise money by selling cotton, you know, cotton environment, the idea of using the ocean as a blockade, that's all environment. It's an environment. And there have been some really good scholars who have done some really more significant and deeper work on this. And I've of course, I've quoted them and referenced them in my chapter. But to me, it's a fascinating aspect of looking at war from the perception of geography and environmental history, you know. And a lot of these guys, these commanders, I think one of the things that I want to do, I know I talked to you about this other book, but for some reason I've gotten really interested in the history and the geography of topographical engineering. And that might be something I might be moving on to look at the history of that. Because it was the U.S. Army that basically carried out the initial surveys of the United States. Right. And you know, and that it forms a basis for how we perceive ourselves. And I find that very interesting because there's the difference between geography and environment and cartography. And
And West Point was a military academy, but it was an engineering school. It
Yeah.
was all about
Yeah.
terrain and geography
Yeah.
and topography.
Yeah.
So it's all interconnected. It's interesting. How have your peers and the critics received this? What kind of feedback have you gotten from them?
I haven't got, well, the book came out in March, and here we are in November, so it usually takes about a year or two before you get the arrows or the praise. So,
Right.
I don't know. I'll have to see. I'm not, I haven't gone out and cultivated reviews or anything. It's a book that I want to do. I put it out there.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of like my hobby with my music. I put it out there. You either like it or you don't. And I mean, in academia, you have to sort of develop a bit of a thick skin, or you're not going to get,
Mm-hmm.
people are going to
Right.
take pot shots at you. I don't know. I just remember the initial thing when I was talking in Ireland. I was trying to get it promoted in this. I don't know what the name of the publication is, but it's something that The Conversation, I think it's called.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I said that. They asked me, and I put this idea that it goes from the initial geomythology of like the Epic of Gilgamesh in the Bible, and then up to the idea that Gaia, weaponized against us. And I never heard back. So that doesn't really bother me because I do what I do. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
Springer books, the one drawback is they're so expensive, so they just tend to go to deposit libraries.
I see.
So for my next publication, although Springer's been very good to me, I'm probably going to try to find a more mainstream publisher, so books will be less expensive. And draw upon what I've learned by doing this. Because this was a learning exercise.
Yes.
Every for me anyway, I don't know about other people, but when I write a book, I write it to learn something, to educate myself. And, learning how to have fun with it,
That kind of leads to the next question, which is reflecting on the book. What was the most rewarding aspect of writing this book for you?
Just being able to explore these fields that I didn't have to do it for any reason except for my joy and interest in these things.
Right.
And also being in a routine, of course. My wife and children live in Dublin, Ireland, so I'm over here by myself when I'm over here. And I remember writing it last summer before they came over for their holidays, the month of June. And just being able to come in every day and have this, you have the white wall, they call it, when you write, but also to have that, to do. And just being in that place where I wouldn't say they're characters, but personalities and perspectives are dancing around in your head, and you're trying to put it down in a cohesive narrative on paper.
Right.
I found that really rewarding, being able to dip into, different writers and thinkers and historians, and it's sort of like a playground, a mental playground.
Do you foresee ever writing fiction?
I have written fiction, and historical fiction is the genre that I read. I mean,
Yes, okay.
detective fiction as well, but historical. And I've thought about it. Hilary Mantel has some interesting notions about how historians and writers go about things. So you could read sort of a really sort of detailed history of Thomas Cromwell and his relationship with Henry VIII, or you can read Hilary Mantel and you'll get the same thing. You get the sense of it, and that really excites me.
Yes.
But I there are writers that you hear they get up, like Larry Mercury is one of my literary heroes. He would get up and he would write every day 5,000. I do that with music.
Yes.
but I don't do it with. My uncle is a novelist,
Oh.
and I've just never. I've thought about it, but I've never had that sort of impulse. And it is an impulse. It's sort of something that comes to you. I think I could do it if I. But there's other things that, I mean, to me, these ideas come out of the air. They snatch.
Yes.
And the academia allowed me a structured way to do that, to write and make a living, which is important, especially when you start having children.
Yes.
So, you know, the lives of some of the writers that I've really admired are just, it seems that, you know, sort of lonely and impulsive. And I also come from a family of teachers, so I think there's an element to that why I'm in academia. Everybody likes to hear themselves talk, you know. So academia is the greatest teaching is the greatest way to do that, I suppose.
Right.
So possibly, but I what I have thought about though, and this sounds maybe off the wall, is doing. You know how like the Who had concept records like Quadrophenia.
Yes.
Doing something like that, but with American history. You know, and I don't think anybody's done that. I think Robbie Robertson tried to with his last couple albums, Storyville, which is about a neighborhood in New Orleans, and it was sort of impressions of sort of a history of storytelling, something like that. I think that would be interesting. I think
Tying music and literature and
history and geography all together,
yeah.
and you know, have it wrapped up in a Broadway stage production where I could, you know, one of the things that fascinated me was Hamilton. And I've never been able to sit my way all the way through it. I like the music and everything, but when I first heard about it, I thought, this guy's a genius. You know, this guy is a genius. This was something, he's basically taking, was it Ron Chernow's book?
Right.
And making a, you know, a musical out of it using hip hop and R&B. And I thought that was fascinating. And I thought, you know, that would be something, but with, you know, more my sort of country rock blues, sort of, you know, indie pop sort of approach. And, you know, so something like that engages people in history and geography, but in a way that shows them that we're not just dried up old subjects, you know.
Right.
You know what I mean? That it's engaging and lively, and you know, you can bring your own interest to it and develop your own way of doing it.
And as I often say, it gives a different perspective on the stereotypical academic as the pipe smoking, tweed jacket, elbow patch wearing.
That's right. Sort of elite ivory tower.
Exactly.
Sort of, which you know has been cultivated, but it's not really the way it is.
Certainly not anymore.
No, not anymore.
So what advice do you have for students or younger academics who are interested in pursuing a career in research and writing? Do you have any advice?
Yes, have passion for your subject, because the rest, the BS you have to put up with is not worth it if you're not interested in what you do.
Right.
And I had a passion for Ireland when I started my journey in geography, and not necessarily for medicine. My dad had a passion for medicine.
Yes.
I didn't really share that. But I had a passion for what I was doing, my interest. And I think that's the most important thing. So, you know, be honest with yourself about why you're doing what you're doing. And you're going to have to work hard. But if you have something that you're really passionate about and interested in, you'll cultivate it.
Well, that comes across in the book, and I think that's one of the things that really grabbed me about the book, is that it's not purely academic. It is, you can read just the intro and tell, you know, this is a passion project. This is more than just an academic exercise.
Well, I think that's an issue. Historians typically are better writers than geographers. But I've tried to cultivate my writing. I've also tried to make my work accessible without being too dense. You know, there's room for that.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I think that you can present complex ideas in transparent and digestible language.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, you know, it's an art, it's a practice, I continually work on. And so, it's aimed at, it's aimed at somebody who might be interested in this, but perhaps, you know, has no more than a high school education.
Yes.
That's, you know, not to sound, you know, I was lucky I had these opportunities where I could go to college. I mean,
yeah.
When I was 18, I did not want to go to college, but I was the oldest of 7. I wanted to go to underwater welding school because I wasn't a very good student.
Uh-huh.
But my father wouldn't have none of it. And so off to college I went. Probably saved my life because God knows what happened in the Gulf if I
Right.
But I had that opportunity. A lot of people don't. But there's a lot of people out there that are autodidacts. They teach themselves.
Yes.
And I don't know how they would get this book because it's very hard to get, except online. Let's see if you have some money. You could, with the digital revolution has changed all that. So anybody has money can access it. They don't have to go. But it's written for somebody who, you know, doesn't have much time, needs some entertainment, but also wants to educate themselves. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing that'll put you to sleep faster than a very boring textbook on something.
Right.
Unless you're motivated to do it because you're in a class. If I need this, I'll do it. Yeah. But if you don't, and you still want to, you want to be able to, your audience, you want to entertain and edify at the same time. And that's what I was trying to do, tell stories. Because the stories were curious to me, particularly Washington's, how weather really environment played a role in resurrecting. Because the revolution might have just died there in New York.
Right.
And that would have been the end of it. And who knows, you know, we'd be a colony, we'd be like Australia, you know. I mean, and so it changed. And that sort of stuff, you know, it really interests me. And I do think that geography plays a big role in the way that we should try to perceive history and vice versa.
Mm-hmm. Very good.
So,
well, thanks very much for agreeing to do this.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
You're welcome. It's been an interesting book, an interesting conversation.
It's been interesting. I'll say that much. It's been an interesting journey, but this was sort of a fun project. And there are things that you have to do in academia and things that you like to do. And this is something I like to do.
Good.
And I enjoyed it, and glad that you enjoyed it too, and hope other people enjoy it. Environment is a weapon.
Thank you very much.